Hi there, welcome to our first live stream for the Gender Representation in the Media online class. If you've been watching the videos so far over the last couple of weeks, you will have met me already. Hello, I'm Karen Boyle, and I'm Professor of Feminist Media Studies at the University of Strathclyde and lead educator on this course. So over the next wee while, I'm going to answer some of the questions that you've already sent in and offer some reflections on what's been happening on the course so far. If you have any questions you'd like to pose to me whilst we're live, please do so. Okay, so I just want to start off by thanking you all for your engagement on the course so far. I've been really impressed by the range of examples that are coming up, and from my perspective, it's really great to be able to hear about what's happening in other parts of the world that are not where I'm working. I think one of the things I've noticed across a wide range of your comments in relation to a range of the tasks is the extent to which thinking about gender and the media really is challenging us to think about what it is we take for granted, I guess. So to try and think differently about things that just are all around us and we may not be used to thinking critically about. And I've seen that in your comments on the news, but also when you're thinking about things like Disney films. So it's great to see a range of examples coming in there. I think maybe it's also useful to just remind ourselves that having a critical eye isn't necessarily about having to give up things we love. So we can be critical friends to the things that we love. We can ask them to do better. We can ask them to include us more. It's not simply about moving away from certain kinds of representations, though that will also be an issue, and we'll talk a bit about that. Okay, so in terms of getting underway with your questions, I want to start with what I thought was a really brilliant and positive question, which is what can we do to improve things? And I hope that that's a question we'll be engaging with really throughout this course, and you'll get lots of different answers to it. But I thought I'd offer us some opening answers in terms of some of the ways I think we can all be involved in doing things to improve where we're at. So I want to start really with thinking about what we can all do, so on quite a personal level. I'd say that the first step is becoming critical consumers, becoming aware of what we see and being willing to challenge where we think things aren't right. And highlighting problems can, of course, be about calling out where we see people not being represented, also where we see problems in representation. But highlighting problems can also be, I think it's really important to think about that online and the role we all have as content producers online, but also the role we have often as bystanders and as critical bystanders when we see problematic things taking place online. And we'll talk a bit about that next week in relation to ideas about digital citizenship and what our responsibilities are, as well as what some of our rights are online. And I think it can be quite easy to say, well, when we see bad things, we've got to call it out. And I absolutely think we should. But I think one of the other ways in which we can actually improve things is by really shouting when we see things that are right. And, giving praise where praise is due. And I think that's particularly important because a lot of media organisations, when they do try to change things or mix things up a bit or challenge the status quo, often get quite a lot of backlash for doing so. And so I think that actually being those supportive voices that say, we see this change, we appreciate this change, this is a move in the right direction, is actually an important thing to do and can also encourage other people to seek out what we think are good representations. And I'll just give you a couple of personal examples of this from the last week. If any of you are in the UK, and there's a bit of a spoiler alert here, but if any of you are in the UK and watching the current series of Doctor Who, you will have noticed that last weekend, for the first time, they cast a black woman in the role of the Doctor. This was in a complicated story that we're not quite sure how it's going to play out yet. And that casting had a really significant backlash online. So actually showing where we appreciate that casting is really important, I think. And another example of some good practice I've seen this week, my own research focuses quite a lot on sexual violence and representation. So as you can imagine, I've been following the media coverage of Harvey Weinstein's trial very closely. And one thing I've been really heartened by is that one of our major newspapers in the UK, The Guardian, has actually started publishing helplines for sexual assault, helplines in both the USA and UK at the end of their stories on Weinstein. And that's something that lots of the organisations we've worked with in putting this course together, like Rape Crisis Scotland, Zero Tolerance, that's something that they call for as good practice in reporting sexual assault. So when I've seen those helplines being listed, I've been trying to highlight, look, this is good practice, well done, thank you for doing this, guys. And I think, when you see things like this, it is helpful to highlight the good practice as well as, call out the bad. And actually a lot of feminist and women's organisations globally do that in their work through highlighting, through awards, through highlighting and rewarding good practice. So I think it's helpful to do that. And it can also save us a bit from the depths of despair sometimes. Another thing I think we can all do is to expand our own frame of reference. So search out material that's not just from one point of view, whether that's our own or the dominant point of view within any particular media culture. And we can do that quite obviously by thinking about who we follow on social media, which voices we amplify, but also thinking about supporting alternative media outlets and drawing attention to their work where we can. And the final thing I'd say about the personal in all of this is that for those of us who live in contexts where public service broadcasting exists, it's really important that we remember that public service broadcasters are owned by us and we can demand better of them. I think it's no accident that actually in a number of areas, including for instance in relation to sport, which we'll look at in week 6, television often does better than, say, print media in its in the UK. This is in its representation of women in particularly in relation to sport, and that's not incidental to the fact that we have a public service broadcaster, and so they have got a responsibility to all of the audience, men, women, and everyone else in the audience. So we can demand better of our public service broadcasters. And where public funds are being used for subsidies or to help fund film and television production, for instance, again, we've got a right to ask how our money's being used. So these are all some of the ways in which we can get involved. On a structural level, so sticking with this question of how can we improve things, on a structural level, I've been really struck by comments from those of you who are also journalists about how difficult this can be to do, so that you want to get it right, but actually the time and resources that you have make that quite a challenge. And that's something that I hope we've tried to take seriously in this course. And you'll hear from a number of organisations, a number of women's and feminist organisations who are trying to change media representation, about some of the strategies they've taken to try and work really constructively with journalists who are under those pressures. And one example, for instance, that you'll hear about in week 4 is how organisations including Scottish Women's Aid and Zero Tolerance responded to what they identified as a problem in the images that were consistently being used in the Scottish press to illustrate stories about domestic abuse. And conversations with journalists revealed that the reason these images were being used is that there just weren't better ones. So it's then about, okay, how can we create better images? How can we give news organisations what they actually need? And actually, another way in which we've been trying to do this here is also thinking about who are the experts, making experts who are not part of the circle of the usual suspects more accessible to media organisations. And my colleague Talat Jacob has been doing brilliant work on this as part of Gender Equal Media Scotland with our Pass the Mic initiative, which is a database of women of colour experts in Scotland and the different areas of expertise they have. So once we produce these kind of tools, it's our responsibility, obviously, to get them out there, but it also takes away that excuse of we don't have the time, we don't have the resources, because, you know, here they are, we're giving them to you. So thinking about how we can actually do more of that kind of work in different areas is very valuable, I think. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say in response to that question of how we can improve things, but I do really encourage you to share your own thoughts about that and examples of good practice that you've seen where you are in the comments on the different steps each week. So I look forward to continuing that conversation. You did have some questions specifically about media monitoring that I'm going to address now. So someone had asked about how we deal with non-traditional and particularly online media in media monitoring, and that's a very good question. I think it's fair to say that what we call legacy media, so press, broadcasting in particular, have been the focus of most of the large-scale and certainly the longitudinal, as in going over time, media monitoring projects. The Global Media Monitoring Project, which you've heard about a lot this week, has, in its last iteration for the first time, started to look at online content. But even then, the emphasis has been really on mass-consumed online content. So we're not yet looking at some of those smaller news organisations that may be getting alternative views out there. And that is a limitation of those kind of very large-scale studies. There are, of course, lots of other ways of doing this research. And there's been some really interesting work emerging on Twitter, for instance, that's not monitoring per se, but is looking at, for instance, how female politicians use Twitter in their political campaigning or in their day-to-day work. And that kind of work is starting to help us unpick how platforms like Twitter might work rather differently to legacy media. Some of this requires different methodologies and skills that are beyond the remit of what we're going to cover in this course, but we will try to point you towards some research which we think is doing that kind of work well. And certainly next week, as I've already suggested, you will hear about some of the work on online media that's been looking at issues of abuse in particular. The other question someone had asked about media monitoring that I thought was really helpful to highlight is the problem of double counting. So someone had made the point that actually newspaper X might be covering the same story, using the same sources, I should say, as newspaper Y, because they're using syndicated news, they're using news agencies and news wires. And that's a really valuable point. I think in terms of the methodology of something like the Global Media Monitoring Project, that doesn't undercut what it is we're doing with that, because it's still, that story should be counted twice because it exists in two different places. But I want to answer that point really by thinking about it slightly differently and really highlighting that actually that kind of double counting should remind us of just how important in lots of ways legacy media are, even in some of these newer outlets. So what we find a lot is that the media are reporting on themselves. So if there's a big political interview on television, that interview itself may be watched by a particular proportion of the population, but many, many more people will encounter that interview through accounts of it on social media, through accounts of it in the press, discussion shows on radio, and more. And I mention that because that kind of interrelated nature of all our media should remind us that it's not just the responsibility of media organisations to get representation right, but it's also where political parties, for instance, who are putting people forward for these kind of debates, interviews, or selecting spokespeople on particular topics, really need to be thinking about who they're putting forward, with the sense that actually it's not just that moment that this relates to, but actually how that story is then going to unfold over days. So yes, the media have a responsibility here, and they can certainly be turning round to political parties and saying, you know, we want a choice, give us a male or female spokesperson, so we can choose in terms of the overall balance of a panel debate, for instance. But actually, political parties, businesses, large third sector organisations, all these kind of organisations need to think about their own communication strategies too. So I think all these things do interconnect. So I'm now going to move on to the Bechdel test, because you had some really great examples of thinking about movies in relation to the Bechdel test, but also some questions about what other measures are available. Well, the Bechdel test, as we say in some of the content for this week, really started off as something of an in-joke. It was never meant to become a kind of international barometer for the presence of women in movies. But actually, the things it pointed to, I think, are quite helpful to think about, because it's not just about are women there, but it's about are women there, are they focused on men when they are there, and are they interacting with other women? And these are quite useful questions to consider. There are media monitoring projects that have systematised some of this stuff. So in some of the written material for this week, I talk about the ongoing work in San Diego called the Celluloid Ceiling Project, which looks at the roles that men and women play in the top grossing films at the US box office in any individual year. And they look at things not just about how many women there are, but they look at things like who's in leading roles and who's in supporting roles, where there's ensemble casts. They look at intersections of gender and age, as well as race. And they also, one of the measures I just wanted to mention and highlight, because I think it's really quite interesting, is that the way they attempt to see how male-dominated the film world is actually by looking at the number of characters in speaking roles overall who are male or female. So the most recent study, for instance, found that 82% of films had 10 or more male characters in speaking roles, where only 35% of films had 10 or more female characters in speaking roles. And when they looked at the small numbers, women far outnumbered men. So there was 13% of films with just either 0 to 4 women in speaking roles, but only 6% of men, only 6% of films had that few men. Now, why I think that's interesting is it really encourages us to think about the broader universe that we're seeing on screen and the extent to which it reflects the world we live in. So it's not just to think about leading characters, it's to think about everybody who's in that world who gets to speak. And I think that's a valuable thing to do and can help us see and understand some patterns that we might just take for granted or think aren't really important. That's just a group of people talking, but actually who's in that group, who's represented and who's not. One of the examples a few people had been discussing in relation to the Bechdel test is the film Bombshell, which is currently in cinemas. And that film focuses on the sexual harassment case against the former CEO of Fox News, Roger Ailes, who left Fox News following sexual harassment and assault reports in 2017. And the film focuses on two of the women who reported sexual harassment against Ailes and a third woman who isn't a real character but is a composite. Now, I thought it was really interesting that there was some discussion of this film, because the film has very much been promoted as a film with 3 female leads, all 3 of whom have been nominated for different acting awards over the last few months. And so you'd think from looking at it, this is absolutely a film about women. But yet there was some discussion about, well, actually, are the women interacting with each other, and are they interacting with each other only to talk about their experiences at the hands of men. Now, I mention it because I happened to see the film this week, and I think it does pass the Bechdel test. But your discussions had got me thinking about it in a way that I might not have thought about it otherwise, which was to really think about what the wider universe that these characters were positioned in was. And I think that's a useful thing to do. It does only get us so far, of course, and we've also started to see examples of the kind of other things we might want to pay attention to, like language, like costuming, props, and various other things. So there's lots more we can think about, but even some of this quite quantitative measuring can be quite helpful, I think. Okay, so I've got a couple more questions I want to deal with that are going to take us in a slightly different direction. Someone had asked or drawn attention to casting for the Harry Potter films and stage show, and particularly the fact that whilst in the films Hermione was played by a white actress, Emma Watson. When it came to casting Hermione in the stage show of The Cursed Child, there was a very controversial decision to cast a black actress in the role of Hermione. And the question broadly was, did this represent progress? Well, I do remember the furore about that casting, the media furore about that casting when it happened. And for me, why that was actually quite a useful discussion was it made me really think about the extent to which whiteness is assumed. So J.K. Rowling argued that she didn't describe Hermione as white within the books. I haven't reread them all in order to check if that's true. But her statement of that, and other people have debunked that, but her statement really did make me think about, okay, well, I always saw Hermione as white, so what does that tell me in itself? And I think in terms of, that makes us think not just about production, but also the importance of reading context and how we interpret what's in front of us. So there was discussion at the time from a number of black girl readers or black women readers talking about how important it was to them to be able to see Hermione, themselves reflected in Hermione. And certainly I think that when it comes to adaptation, we've seen lots of discussion of these issues to do with gender and also to do with race when beloved texts are adapted for the screen. But of course adaptation always responds to the culture and the context in which the adaptation takes place, as well as the one in which the original text was written. And I think adaptations always have to be and always have been adaptive. So I don't think that's something we should seek to restrict, and it actually opens up our imagination. At the same point in time, I think we've got to be careful that that kind of casting doesn't suggest that we've solved the problem. And I think it certainly doesn't get us round the fact that we need representations which are specifically and clearly representations of people from marginalised groups. It's not enough to say, for instance, that Hermione could be black. I think we need to have characters in, really prominent texts, films, books, everywhere, who are quite definitely black girls, and have that front and centre. So I think that's what I'd say about that. And then finally, I think there were some questions about Me Too, and someone had asked if I'd witnessed anything positive in relation to Me Too. I don't want to give away too much of what we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks when we look at violence. But I think in some ways this does take me back to where I started this discussion by thinking about, where is there progress, where can we see progress, and also what can we do about things. And a couple of examples that I've been heartened by. I think the key one is really that women's voices, some women's voices, still not all, but some women's voices are being heard. I think one of the things that frustrated me with the mainstream media story around Me Too was the idea that women were suddenly speaking for the first time, when actually what many of the women coming forward were saying was, I've been telling people this for decades, but no one's been listening. So we do need to think about what's the context in which listening or being heard is possible. But I have found it heartening that women are being heard, are being listened to. At the same time, I think it's been disheartening that the range of women being heard and listened to and the range of voices being amplified in mainstream media is still relatively limited. So there's clearly a lot of work to do. And the other thing, again, which we'll pick up in week 4, which I think is always important to keep in mind with something like Me Too or the current reporting of the Weinstein case, is the double-edged sword, if you like, that shows us why this representation matters. And it matters even just at a very basic level, because whenever there's a high-profile sexual assault case in the news, or indeed in television fictions, calls to rape crisis helplines go up considerably. And that tells us that when people see themselves reflected on the screen or hear stories like theirs being told in the news, it can enable them to seek support and start thinking perhaps about looking for justice. And that's a hugely important role of the media that we shouldn't underestimate. At the same time, of course, many of those people calling helplines are doing so because they are re-traumatised by the way in which these stories are being told. And that's what I mean by the double-edged sword. So I'm sorry not to answer the question about what's the positive only with the positives, because I think for all the positives we also need to be alert to the context and in which those are limited, if you like. Okay, so I'm just going to see, have we any further questions at the moment? So if there's no further questions at the moment, I'll wrap up for this live stream. A few things to say in conclusion. Firstly, please do keep your comments coming. We're really enjoying hearing from you and enjoying your different examples, so please keep them coming. We will have another live stream in week 4, so in 2 weeks' time, and that's the week when we're focusing specifically on violence. But as today, I'll take your questions then from any part of the course, so please feel free to send those in. And we'll have another live stream at the end of the course as well. So I look forward to talking to you a bit more then. But I suppose for me, really, the final thing to say today, it would be kind of odd in a course about the media, particularly on the eve of our week on the media, gender and politics, not to say something about the biggest news story today where I am, which is of course Brexit and Britain's departure from the EU, something I profoundly regret. Now, I say that because I do want to be explicit that all teaching, like all representation, comes from a position. And we're going to talk about some of the gender issues which have emerged in the coverage of Brexit next week. And indeed, my colleague Michael Higgins will have a new blog on the Gender Equal Media Scotland site, focusing on how particular notions of political masculinity have played out in media coverage of Brexit. But I think as well that there's broader issues both in politics and in media around Brexit, which really get to the heart of a lot of what we're trying to think about in this course, which are about who belongs, who's included, who's excluded, and which lives are valuable. And these are very much intersectional questions. They're questions about class, about national identity, race, religion, sexuality, age and gender. And I know that much of how this narrative has played out, certainly in the British press, has left our European friends, colleagues and students in the UK feeling unwelcome and vulnerable, and I deeply regret that. But I think this really reminds us that representation matters. And so that's, I think, just a really key thing for us to keep in mind throughout this course. I've been heartened by some of the strong messages about belonging and welcome, but I think that representation matters, but so does our actions. So the relationship between those two is really central to the work that we do on this course, and I hope it's something that we'll come back to. So thinking not just about why what the media say matters, but actually our own role in all of this too. So I'll leave you for today on that note and look forward to picking up these conversations over the weeks ahead.